Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to ancient Greece to explore one of the strangest mysteries its greatest minds could never solve: depression. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you wake up in ancient Athens just after sunrise. The air is already warm, the streets are filling with merchants, fishermen are hauling in the morning's catch, and somewhere nearby a philosopher is confidently explaining the meaning of life to anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact. The city is alive. Unfortunately, you are not particularly enthusiastic about participating. Your neighbours are heading toward the agora to gossip about politics, olive prices, and whether Socrates is asking too many annoying questions again. Your friends invite you to share breakfast, but you tell them you're tired. They insist fresh air will help. You insist your blanket has become emotionally important to you. You stay home, not because you're lazy, not because you're sick, not because you're grieving someone you loved. You simply don't feel like yourself anymore. You stop caring about your work. Food tastes strangely dull. The festivals that once excited you now feel exhausting. Even the thought of walking across the city sounds about as appealing as volunteering to row a trireme during a storm. The ancient Greeks saw people like you. They understood sadness after a funeral. They understood fear before battle. They understood heartbreak, disappointment, jealousy, and the unique frustration of spending 3 days carving a marble statue, only for someone to say, "The proportions look a little off." Those emotions made sense because they had obvious causes. But what if nothing terrible had happened? What if your life looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, yet every morning felt like carrying an invisible sack of stones uphill? That was the mystery. Today, you might recognize these symptoms as depression. The Greeks couldn't. Their closest word was melancholia, but it covered an enormous range of conditions. A person who felt deeply sad, someone consumed by anxiety, another plagued by frightening thoughts, and even someone suffering certain physical illnesses might all receive the same label. To them, the mind and the body weren't separate kingdoms. If your stomach felt unwell, your thoughts might suffer. If your emotions became dark, perhaps something inside your body had fallen out of balance. The brain itself wasn't seen as the control center of human emotion. Many believed the heart, liver, or other organs played equally important roles. When your mood collapsed, there was no obvious place to begin looking, and that puzzled one of history's smartest civilizations. These were people who measured the earth with astonishing accuracy, mapped the stars, invented formal logic, and somehow found time to argue for hours about whether virtue could actually be taught. Yet when someone quietly withdrew from life for no visible reason, they had no idea why. So physicians searched the body, priests searched the gods, philosophers searched the soul, and all three were convinced the other two had probably missed something important. It was, in many ways, the ancient Greek version of a committee meeting, except everyone was wearing sandals instead of business suits. The more you think about your strange sadness, the more everyone around you starts offering explanations. Your neighbour believes you've been working too hard. Your uncle is convinced you've been working too little. A priest wonders whether you've offended a god without realising it. Meanwhile, a philosopher asks whether you've considered that happiness itself might be an illusion. You immediately regret mentioning you're having a rough week. This was ancient Greece, a civilization where almost everything was believed to have a reason. Randomness was deeply unsatisfying. If lightning struck a tree, someone wanted to know why. If a harvest failed, there had to be an explanation. If a city prospered, philosophers could happily spend decades arguing over the exact cause. Surely the human mind followed rules as well. Unlike many earlier civilizations, the Greeks became increasingly determined to understand the world through observation and reasoning. Instead of simply accepting that mysterious forces controlled everything, they began asking difficult questions. What caused disease? Why did people age? Why did one person recover while another died? These questions eventually transformed medicine and philosophy. Yet emotional suffering proved remarkably stubborn. If you arrived with a broken arm, everyone could see the problem. If you developed a fever, they could observe your symptoms. But if you simply woke every morning feeling weighed down by invisible despair, where exactly was the injury? You couldn't point to it. There was no bruise, no bleeding, no swelling. Unfortunately, ancient physicians had left their magnetic resonance imaging machines at home, so they searched elsewhere. Some believed the answer had to lie somewhere inside the body. Others suspected invisible spiritual forces. Still others argued that your thoughts themselves had become disordered. Each explanation sounded reasonable because, in truth, no one had better evidence. This uncertainty created something surprisingly familiar: competing experts. Visit one healer, and he might recommend a change in diet. Visit another, and he might suggest making an offering to Asclepius. Spend an afternoon with a philosopher, and you'll probably leave with 3 new questions, 2 contradictory answers, and the uncomfortable feeling that you somehow caused your own confusion. Despite these disagreements, everyone shared one important belief: your suffering was real. They might completely misunderstand its cause, but few serious thinkers denied that profound emotional pain existed. They saw people withdraw from their families, abandon careers, lose interest in pleasures they once loved, and struggle through days that seemed perfectly ordinary to everyone else. The challenge wasn't recognizing the problem. The challenge was discovering where it actually began. And before long, one physician would propose a theory so influential that it would dominate medicine for nearly 2,000 years. His explanation centered on something called black bile, a substance that would become history's most famous scapegoat for sadness. If you visited one of ancient Greece's most respected physicians and described the strange heaviness that had settled over your life, he probably wouldn't ask about your childhood, your stress levels, or whether you'd been sleeping well. Instead, he might become very interested in your bile, not the answer you were hoping for, admittedly. Around the 5th century before Christ, the physician Hippocrates and the medical tradition that followed him began promoting an idea that would shape medicine for centuries. The human body was governed by 4 vital fluids, or humours. Health depended on keeping them in perfect balance. There was blood associated with warmth and vitality, yellow bile linked to anger and energy, phlegm connected with calmness and sluggishness, and finally, black bile, the most mysterious of them all. According to this theory, if your body produced too much black bile, it could darken not only your physical health, but your emotions as well. Fear, hopelessness, anxiety, endless worrying, and overwhelming sadness were all believed to flow from this invisible imbalance. In fact, the very word melancholy comes from the Greek words melas, meaning black, and chole, meaning bile. It was less a poetic metaphor than a genuine medical diagnosis. To modern ears, blaming sadness on an excess of dark, digestive fluid sounds rather absurd. But in fairness, the Greeks were trying to solve an incredibly difficult puzzle with the tools they actually had. They couldn't examine neurons. They couldn't measure brain chemistry. They had no understanding of neurotransmitters, hormones, or genetics. What they did have was careful observation. They noticed that emotions often affected the body. Someone frightened might tremble. A grieving person could lose weight. Anxiety could upset the stomach. Long before scientists explained the connection between mind and body, the Greeks had already realized the two constantly influenced one another. Their conclusion was incorrect. Their observations were surprisingly sharp. Imagine visiting a physician after weeks of feeling empty inside. He studies your complexion, asks about your appetite, checks your pulse, examines your urine, questions your sleep, and carefully listens to your answers. There are no laboratory tests to confirm anything, so nearly every diagnosis depends upon experience and educated guesswork. Oddly enough, this made Greek medicine feel surprisingly personal. Doctors spent considerable time observing patients because observation was almost all they possessed. And once black bile became the leading explanation for melancholy, treatments naturally focused on restoring balance rather than changing thoughts. Special diets, exercise, warm baths, herbal mixtures, and carefully regulated daily routines all became part of the physician's toolkit. Whether they actually reduced black bile was another matter entirely. The black bile itself almost certainly didn't exist. But the idea behind it, that emotional suffering could have a natural physical cause instead of being simple weakness or divine punishment, was one of the most revolutionary ideas the ancient world had ever produced. Once Greek physicians decided that melancholy came from an imbalance inside the body, the next question seemed obvious. What was causing that imbalance in the first place? The answer, they believed, was almost everything. If you had been living in ancient Greece, your doctor would have wanted to know what you ate, how much you slept, whether you exercised, what season it was, how old you were, where you lived, and perhaps even which direction the wind had been blowing lately. To a modern patient, it might sound like the world's longest medical questionnaire. To a Greek physician, it was simply being thorough. The Greeks believed your body was constantly interacting with the world around it. Summer heat could make one humour stronger. Winter cold could strengthen another. A damp climate affected the body differently from a dry one. Even the changing seasons were thought to shift the balance of the humours. Spring encouraged growth. Summer brought heat and energy. Autumn signalled decline. Winter, however, was often associated with coldness, inactivity, and melancholy. If you've ever looked outside on a dark winter morning and thought, "I'd rather stay in bed," congratulations, you've accidentally agreed with a physician from 24 centuries ago. Food mattered just as much. Heavy meals, excessive wine, rich meats, or an unbalanced diet were all suspected of disturbing the body's harmony. Physicians often recommended simple foods, vegetables, grains, fish, fruit, and moderate portions. Eating too much was considered unhealthy. Eating too little was equally dangerous. As with nearly everything in Greek thought, moderation was king. Even exercise came with rules. Too little movement supposedly allowed harmful humours to stagnate inside the body. Too much exercise exhausted both body and mind. The ideal citizen walked, worked, trained, rested, and ate in careful proportion. Balance wasn't simply medical advice, it was practically a national obsession. Of course, none of this actually cured depression. But surprisingly, some recommendations weren't entirely misguided. Regular physical activity, nutritious food, steady routines, sufficient sleep, and spending time outdoors are all habits modern medicine still encourages for supporting mental health. Greek physicians simply misunderstood why they sometimes helped. They imagined they were draining excess black bile. In reality, they were occasionally improving overall well-being through healthier lifestyles. Still, Not everyone recovered. Some people followed every piece of advice. They ate carefully, exercised daily, avoided excess wine, and lived disciplined lives. Yet the sadness remained. That left physicians facing an uncomfortable possibility. If food, weather, and the body couldn't explain every case of melancholy, perhaps the answer wasn't entirely physical. Perhaps someone, or something, far more powerful had become involved. And in ancient Greece, whenever human understanding reached its limits, the gods were never very far away. Not every Greek believed your sadness could be explained by black bile. In fact, if you wandered through the streets of Athens asking people why someone had fallen into deep despair, you would probably receive enough different answers to keep philosophers employed for another 5 centuries. Some pointed to the body. Others looked toward Olympus. After all, the gods were involved in nearly every aspect of Greek life. They governed the seas, the harvests, the weather, victories in battle, successful marriages, and unfortunate hairstyles, although Zeus himself occasionally struggled in that department. Why wouldn't they influence the human mind as well? To the Greeks, the line between the natural and the supernatural was remarkably thin. A sudden illness might have a physical cause, but it could also be a sign that a god had become displeased. An unexpected run of bad fortune could simply be bad luck, or it might be divine punishment for an offence you didn't even realise you had committed. That uncertainty made emotional suffering especially frightening. Imagine waking each morning feeling weighed down by despair, with no obvious explanation. Naturally, you would begin searching your memory. Had you broken an oath? Failed to honour your ancestors? Neglected a sacrifice? Insulted a god without realising it? The possibilities were endless, which was rather inconvenient, considering the gods were not famous for leaving helpful instruction manuals. Apollo, the god of healing, could both send disease and remove it. Dionysus, associated with wine and ecstatic celebration, also represented madness and emotional extremes. The terrifying Furies pursued those guilty of terrible crimes, driving them toward relentless torment. In myth after myth, divine forces reach directly into human thoughts and emotions. To modern readers, these stories sound symbolic. To many ancient Greeks, they reflected genuine possibilities. This didn't necessarily mean every physician abandoned medicine in favour of religion. Quite the opposite. Many people comfortably accepted both explanations at once. A physical imbalance might exist, but perhaps a god had allowed that imbalance to occur. There was no contradiction. The body and the divine could work together. This blending of medicine and religion shaped nearly every aspect of Greek healing. You might consult a physician for dietary advice during the day, then visit a temple that evening to offer prayers for recovery. Just to be safe. Because if your doctor happened to be wrong, annoying a god seemed like an unnecessary gamble. Yet despite the sacrifices, prayers and rituals, many people remained trapped in their sadness. Which raised another difficult question. If the gods weren't speaking through suffering, could healing come from speaking to the gods instead? For that answer, thousands of Greeks made pilgrimages to one of the most extraordinary places in the ancient world, the healing sanctuaries of Asclepius, where sleep itself became part of the cure. If diet hadn't lifted your spirits, and prayers at your local shrine hadn't eased the weight on your mind, there was still one place many Greeks believed could help. You packed a few belongings, said goodbye to your family, and began the journey to a sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. This wasn't an ordinary temple. It was something closer to an ancient hospital, spa, retreat, and religious sanctuary, all rolled into one. Imagine checking into a wellness centre, where your doctor also believed divine dreams were part of the treatment plan. Surprisingly, for many visitors, that sounded perfectly reasonable. The most famous sanctuary stood at Epidaurus, nestled among green hills far from the noise of the cities. People travelled for days, sometimes weeks, hoping to find relief from blindness, painful joints, fevers, mysterious illnesses, and the strange sadness that no physician seemed able to explain. You wouldn't simply walk in and ask for an appointment. First came purification. You bathed. You washed away both physical dirt and, symbolically, spiritual impurity. You offered sacrifices, usually modest gifts or animals, depending on your means. You prayed. The journey itself became part of the healing process, separating you from the worries of everyday life. Only then came the most remarkable part. You went to sleep. The ritual was called incubation. Patients spent the night inside a sacred sleeping hall, believing that Asclepius would appear in their dreams. Sometimes the god supposedly spoke directly, offering advice or revealing the cause of an illness. Other times he performed miraculous surgery while you slept, leaving you to wake feeling restored. By modern hospital standards, this was an unconventional treatment plan. On the other hand, the waiting room was probably much quieter. When morning arrived, priests asked you to describe every detail of your dream. Nothing was considered meaningless. A snake, a river, an old man, a child, or even an ordinary meal might contain hidden instructions from the god. The priests interpreted these visions and suggested treatments. Sometimes the advice involved herbs or exercise. Sometimes it required changes in daily habits. Occasionally it involved further rituals or offerings. To us this may sound like superstition, yet the experience itself could be genuinely comforting. You had left your daily routine behind. You were surrounded by peaceful gardens, fresh air, gentle walks, sacred ceremonies, and people who believed your suffering deserved attention rather than ridicule. You were listened to carefully. You rested. You slept. You felt cared for. None of that cured depression outright, but compassion, hope, quiet surroundings, and the belief that recovery was possible have always possessed a remarkable kind of medicine, even if the Greeks believed the prescription had arrived through a dream. While physicians searched the body for the source of melancholy, another group of Greeks was searching somewhere entirely different. They were looking inside the mind, or more accurately, inside what they called the soul. If you found yourself overwhelmed by sadness, one philosopher might not ask what you had eaten or whether you had visited the temple of Asclepius. Instead, he might ask a far more uncomfortable question. What are you thinking about all day? Welcome to ancient Greek philosophy, where even a casual conversation had a habit of turning into an unexpected examination of your entire existence. Socrates, for example, believed that understanding yourself was one of the greatest tasks in life. His famous instruction, "Know thyself," wasn't meant as a pleasant slogan to hang on your bedroom wall. It was a lifelong challenge. He believed people often suffered because they lived without truly examining their beliefs, desires, and choices. Of course, if you simply wanted someone to tell you why you felt miserable, receiving another question instead may have been slightly frustrating. His student Plato took a different approach. He imagined the human soul as something that needed harmony, much like a well-tuned musical instrument. Reason should guide your emotions and desires, just as a skilled charioteer controls powerful horses. When those parts fell out of balance, inner conflict followed. Aristotle, meanwhile, believed happiness wasn't simply an emotion that appeared by chance. It was something built gradually through good habits, meaningful friendships, learning, moderation, and living a virtuous life. Happiness, in his view, resembled a craft more than a gift. That sounds encouraging. Unfortunately, it also meant there was homework. Centuries later, the Stoics pushed these ideas even further. They argued that while you couldn't control what happened around you, you could learn to control your response. Illness, loss, failure, insults, even death itself were often beyond your power. But your judgments about those events belong to you. This philosophy wasn't telling people to ignore sadness. It was teaching them not to become completely ruled by it. Modern psychology still echoes parts of this idea. Cognitive therapies often explore how our thoughts influence our emotions, although they do so with scientific methods the Greeks could never have imagined. Even so, the philosophers missed something important. You cannot always reason your way out of depression. A person whose mind is clouded by profound emotional illness may understand every logical argument in the world and still feel trapped beneath its weight. The Greeks had discovered that thoughts mattered. What they hadn't yet discovered was that sometimes the illness itself changes the way thoughts are formed. And outside the quiet schools of philosophy, ordinary life continued bringing hardships that no amount of careful reasoning could entirely erase. For all their theories about black bile, divine influence, and philosophical balance, the ancient Greeks sometimes overlooked something much simpler. Life itself could be overwhelming. Imagine living in Athens, Sparta, or Corinth. There are no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, no electricity, no central heating, and certainly no weekends. Every day demands work. Every season brings uncertainty. Every journey carries risk. And every family knows loss. If you're a farmer, one bad harvest could leave your household hungry through the winter. If you're a sailor, a single storm might erase years of hard-earned wealth before lunchtime. If you're a soldier, war isn't an extraordinary event. It is simply another possibility hanging over your future. The ancient world had an unfortunate habit of making life expectancy feel more like an optimistic suggestion than a guarantee. Disease was everywhere. Children often died before reaching adulthood. Women faced tremendous danger during childbirth. Epidemics swept through cities with terrifying speed, and no one fully understood why. The famous Plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War killed tens of thousands of people, including the great statesman Pericles, leaving survivors surrounded by grief and uncertainty. Even the strongest minds struggled under such conditions. Loss wasn't unusual. It was expected. Then there was slavery. Modern readers sometimes picture ancient Greece as a civilization of philosophers discussing virtue beneath marble columns. Those philosophers certainly existed. So did hundreds of thousands of enslaved people whose lives were defined by someone else's decisions. Freedom, opportunity, and emotional well-being were luxuries not equally distributed. Women carried their own burdens. Most had limited legal rights, little political influence, and lives centered almost entirely around the household. Many married young, endured repeated pregnancies, and mourned children who never reached adulthood. Public recognition of their emotional struggles was often minimal because society expected quiet endurance above almost everything else. Even wealthy citizens weren't immune. A respected politician constantly feared losing public favour. A successful merchant worried about pirates, dishonest partners, or changing trade routes. Reputation mattered enormously, and one public failure could undo decades of careful work. Pressure came from every direction. The remarkable thing is that the Greeks rarely viewed these experiences as causes of lasting psychological illness. If you were a woman in ancient Greece, life came with challenges that many men scarcely had to consider. Your world was usually much smaller. For many women, especially in cities like Athens, daily life revolved around the household. You managed food stores, spun wool, raised children, supervised servants if your family was wealthy enough to have them, and kept the home running while much of public life happened somewhere you were rarely expected to be. It was demanding work. It was also largely invisible. If you felt overwhelmed, there weren't many places to talk about it. There was no philosopher inviting you into the agora for a thoughtful discussion about the meaning of happiness. Society generally expected women to remain modest, obedient, and resilient. Quiet endurance was admired far more than open emotional struggle. In other words, if life felt unbearably difficult, the official recommendation was often to continue making bread, and perhaps complain only to the bread. Childbirth added another layer of uncertainty. Today, having a baby is still physically demanding. In ancient Greece, it was genuinely dangerous. Every pregnancy carried significant risks. Many women died giving birth, and many infants never survived their first weeks or months of life. Loss visited countless households. A mother who buried several children during her lifetime was sadly not unusual. Grief became a familiar companion, one that society expected her to carry while continuing with the endless responsibilities of daily life. Public mourning rituals did provide some comfort. Women often played the central role in preparing bodies for burial, leading funeral laments, and preserving family memories. Crying openly during these ceremonies wasn't considered weakness. It was an accepted expression of love and loss. But eventually, everyday life resumed. The emotional burden remained. Greek physicians sometimes attempted to explain women's emotional suffering through the body. They believed reproductive organs influenced mood in ways that we now know were largely misunderstood. Some illnesses unique to women were attributed to an unsettled womb or other supposed disturbances within the body. These explanations were incorrect, yet they reflected the same pattern seen throughout Greek medicine. When emotions became difficult to understand, physicians searched for physical causes. Women also experienced another challenge that could quietly deepen sadness: isolation. Many spent long hours inside the household with limited opportunities to participate in public life. Friendships certainly existed. Families remained close, and religious festivals offered moments of connection. But daily routines could still become remarkably confined. Modern research has repeatedly shown that loneliness and social isolation can worsen depression. The Greeks recognized loneliness. They simply didn't realize how deeply it could shape the mind. Like so many mysteries surrounding melancholy, they saw its effects clearly. They just couldn't quite explain the mechanism behind them. By now the Greeks had reached an unusual conclusion. Melancholy wasn't always something to fear. In some cases they began to wonder if it might actually be connected to greatness. It sounds like the sort of theory invented by someone who hadn't slept properly in several weeks. Yet among Greek philosophers, physicians, and writers, this idea became surprisingly influential. The person most often associated with it is Aristotle. A famous passage, traditionally linked to his school, asks a fascinating question. Why do so many extraordinary people seem prone to melancholy? Why, it wondered, were outstanding philosophers, poets, artists, politicians, and even military leaders so often described as deeply sad or emotionally troubled? The question itself was remarkably observant. The answer, however, was rather more speculative. According to the theory, the same black bile that could drag an ordinary person into despair might, in smaller or better balanced amounts, sharpen intelligence and creativity. Too little produced an ordinary temperament. Too much caused overwhelming suffering. But somewhere in the middle, melancholy supposedly helped create exceptional minds. In other words, if you were unusually gloomy, Someone might conclude you were either becoming a genius or simply needed less black bile. Needless to say, this was not an especially precise diagnostic system. Still, the Greeks had noticed something interesting. Many brilliant thinkers seemed restless. They questioned everything. They spent long hours alone. They wrestled with problems that other people ignored. They often appeared dissatisfied with simple answers. From the outside, that could look remarkably similar to emotional suffering. Poets described loneliness with astonishing depth. Tragic playwrights explored grief, guilt, fear, and despair in ways that still resonate today. Philosophers devoted entire careers to asking how human beings could find lasting happiness in an uncertain world. These weren't casual interests. They reflected genuine attempts to understand difficult emotions. Of course, modern psychology would urge caution. Depression does not create genius, nor does intelligence automatically lead to depression. Some creative people struggle with mental illness. Many never do. Likewise, countless people living with depression possess no interest whatsoever in writing philosophy while wearing sandals. The relationship is far more complicated than Aristotle imagined. Even so, his question has never completely disappeared. Researchers today still investigate possible links between creativity, personality, emotional sensitivity, and certain mental health conditions. The conclusions remain complex, and many debates continue. In that sense, Aristotle accidentally asked a question that science is still exploring more than 2,000 years later. The Greeks couldn't explain depression, but they recognized something that remains profoundly true. Some of history's brightest minds have also carried some of its heaviest burdens. Brilliance, it seems, has never been a reliable shield against sorrow. So, what happened if a Greek physician diagnosed you with melancholy? Well, don't expect a prescription to be waiting at your local pharmacy. Instead, your treatment would likely begin with a conversation. The physician would ask about your daily routine, your diet, your sleep, your work, your digestion, and your general way of living. To a modern visitor, it might feel less like a doctor's appointment and more like someone politely auditing your entire existence. Once he believed he understood the problem, the goal was simple: restore balance. Food was often the first medicine. If your diet was thought to encourage an excess of black bile, your physician might recommend lighter meals, more vegetables, fresh fruit, fish, and plenty of barley. Heavy meats and excessive drinking were discouraged. Wine itself wasn't considered harmful in moderation. This was Greece, after all. But drinking enough to argue with a statue of Athena was generally viewed as poor medical practice. Exercise followed naturally. A long walk through the countryside, gentle physical training, or spending time outdoors were all believed to improve both body and mind. Physicians noticed that people who remained active often seemed healthier, even if they misunderstood the biological reasons behind it. Bathing was another favourite recommendation. Warm baths helped relax the body, soothe aching muscles, and create a sense of calm. Combined with massage and scented oils, the experience probably felt rather luxurious compared to the average workday. Sleep also mattered. Greek doctors believed both too much and too little sleep could upset the body's balance. They encouraged regular routines, understanding that rest was an important part of recovery, even if they couldn't explain exactly why. Music held a special place as well. Many philosophers believed certain melodies could calm powerful emotions. Listening to the gentle notes of a lyre or flute wasn't simply entertainment, it was considered therapeutic. Whether through rhythm, beauty, or simple distraction, music often eased troubled minds. Conversation itself became a kind of medicine. Patients spoke with physicians, priests, family members, and philosophers. They weren't receiving modern psychotherapy, of course, but they weren't suffering entirely alone either. Being heard, understood, and treated with compassion has always carried remarkable healing power. Looking back, it's surprising how many Greek treatments resemble advice still offered today. Eat nutritious food, exercise regularly, sleep consistently, spend time outside, listen to music, maintain meaningful relationships. None of these cures depression on their own, but together they can genuinely support mental well-being. The Greeks believed these practices worked because they balanced the humours. Modern science points toward entirely different explanations involving brain chemistry, hormones, nervous system regulation, and social connection. Different theories. Sometimes remarkably similar advice. And yet, despite every walk, every bath, every careful meal, and every soothing melody played on the lyre, some people never truly recovered. That stubborn reality forced Greek physicians to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the greatest mystery wasn't how to treat melancholy. Perhaps it was how little they actually understood about where it came from. For all the wisdom of Hippocrates, the careful observations of Greek physicians, and the endless debates of philosophers, there came a point where every explanation simply stopped. Imagine returning to your doctor after months of following every instruction. You've changed your diet. You've exercised. You've taken long walks. You've visited the temple of Asclepius. You've listened to music, slept more regularly, and even cut back on the wine, which, by Greek standards, was practically an act of heroism. And yet, you still wake each morning with the same invisible weight pressing down on you. What could the physician say? The honest answer was, not very much. The greatest limitation of ancient Greek medicine wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a lack of tools. The Greeks couldn't see inside the living brain. They had no microscopes, no laboratories, no understanding of neurons or neurotransmitters. They knew nothing about serotonin, dopamine, genetics, hormones, or the complex networks that modern neuroscience now studies every day. To them, the brain itself wasn't even universally accepted as the center of thought and emotion. Some philosophers believed the brain played the leading role. Others argued that the heart was where thinking truly happened. A few assigned important functions to the liver or other organs. If the experts couldn't even agree on where emotions lived, discovering how they worked was always going to be difficult. This meant every diagnosis depended almost entirely on observation. Doctors watched. They listened. They compared one patient to another. Sometimes their conclusions were remarkably insightful. Sometimes they were spectacularly wrong. A patient who was deeply depressed might receive the same diagnosis as someone suffering from chronic anxiety. Another person experiencing bipolar disorder could easily be mistaken for someone under divine influence. Hallucinations, severe grief, epilepsy, and what we now recognize as different psychiatric illnesses were often grouped together because they shared visible symptoms. From the physician's perspective, they all belonged to the same mysterious landscape. It would be like trying to repair an intricate clock while blindfolded. You can hear that something isn't working. You just can't see which gear is broken. And despite these enormous limitations, Greek medicine achieved something extraordinary. It insisted that careful observation mattered more than superstition alone. Instead of accepting every illness as the random whim of angry gods, physicians searched for natural explanations. They made notes. They looked for patterns. They questioned old beliefs. They admitted that different patients could respond differently to the same treatment. That curiosity became one of Greece's greatest gifts to medicine. The Greeks couldn't explain depression because the science simply didn't exist yet. But by asking careful questions instead of accepting easy answers, They laid the first stones on a road that physicians and scientists are still walking today. After everything we've explored, the black bile, the gods, the philosophers, the healing temples, you might assume the ancient Greeks got almost everything wrong about depression. That would be a little unfair. Yes, they misunderstood the biology. Yes, black bile is not secretly lurking inside you waiting for an opportunity to ruin your Tuesday. But beneath those mistaken explanations were observations that still feel remarkably modern. For starters, the Greeks understood that the body and mind were deeply connected. They couldn't explain the connection, but they could see it. A person under constant stress often became physically ill. Someone recovering from a serious disease could become emotionally withdrawn. Grief affected sleep. Anxiety affected appetite. Fear could make the heart race and the stomach churn. Those observations were completely real. Modern medicine has simply learned far more about why they happen. The Greeks also appreciated the importance of routine. Their physicians encouraged regular sleep, moderate exercise, nutritious food, fresh air, and avoiding excess in almost everything. It wasn't glamorous advice. There were no miracle cures or magical shortcuts. Just steady habits. Thousands of years later, doctors continue giving surprisingly similar recommendations. Not because they cure depression by themselves, but because they help create the best possible conditions for recovery. Friendship mattered too. Aristotle famously wrote that no one would choose to live without friends, even if they possessed every other advantage in life. To the Greeks, human beings were social creatures by nature. A good life wasn't built alone. They didn't know about social support networks or psychological resilience. They simply noticed that people rarely flourished in complete isolation. They also respected grief. The Greeks understood that mourning wasn't a weakness to hide or something to rush through. Funeral rituals allowed families to cry openly, remember the dead, and lean on one another. They recognized that painful emotions often needed expression rather than suppression. Even today, psychologists emphasize many of those same ideas. Perhaps most importantly, Greek physicians generally believed emotional suffering deserved compassion rather than ridicule. Not every Greek shared that view, of course. Ancient societies could be every bit as judgmental as modern ones, but many physicians genuinely treated melancholy as an illness deserving care instead of a personal failure. That was a remarkable step forward. Of course, they still couldn't explain why one person developed melancholy while another, living almost the same life, did not. That mystery remained. Yet by refusing to dismiss emotional suffering as simple laziness or weakness, they planted an important seed. The explanations were flawed. The curiosity was not. Sometimes history moves forward not because people find the right answers immediately, but because they ask the right questions. And the ancient Greeks were exceptionally good at asking questions that refused to disappear. As the centuries passed, the marble temples slowly crumbled, the great city-states declined, and the ancient world gave way to new empires. But one mystery refused to disappear. Depression outlived them all. The Romans inherited many Greek medical ideas, including the theory of the four humours. Medieval physicians continued speaking of melancholy. Renaissance scholars studied Hippocrates and Aristotle. Even into the 19th century, doctors were still debating ideas that had first taken shape beneath the bright skies of ancient Greece. Black bile proved remarkably difficult to retire. It enjoyed one of the longest careers in medical history, despite never actually existing. Yet perhaps that shouldn't surprise us. When people are searching for answers to something as complicated as the human mind, they tend to hold on to the best explanation they have, at least until a better one comes along. The Greeks were no different. They lived in a world without microscopes, electricity, or scientific laboratories. They couldn't scan the brain or analyze chemicals flowing between nerve cells. They had never heard of serotonin, genetics, trauma, or neurotransmitters, and yet they refused to stop asking questions. Why do some people lose interest in life while others remain hopeful? Why can grief eventually fade for one person, but linger endlessly for another? Why does emotional suffering sometimes appear without any obvious cause? Those questions are still with us. Modern science has made extraordinary progress. We now understand that depression can involve complex interactions between brain chemistry, genetics, hormones, life experiences, chronic stress, physical illness, and countless environmental factors. We have therapies, medications, and treatments that the Greeks could never have imagined. Even so, no scientist would honestly claim that every mystery has been solved. Researchers continue studying why treatments work well for some people, but not others. They continue searching for better medicines, better therapies, and a deeper understanding of one of humanity's most complex conditions. In that sense, we are still walking the same road. We've simply travelled much farther than Hippocrates ever could. Perhaps that's the most remarkable part of this story. The ancient Greeks couldn't explain depression, but they also refused to pretend it wasn't real. They observed it carefully. They debated it endlessly. They searched for natural causes instead of accepting simple answers, and they recognized that invisible suffering could be just as profound as a visible wound. That may be their greatest legacy. Not that they solved the mystery, but that they believed it was worth solving. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, it's comforting to remember that for more than 2,000 years, people have been asking the same questions about the human mind. The answers have changed with every generation. The curiosity never has. Before Grigory Rasputin became the most scandalous man in Imperial Russia, he was simply another peasant from a tiny Siberian village where excitement usually meant someone's cow wandered into the neighbour's vegetable patch. Yet even before his name reached palaces, stories about his unusual relationships with women had already begun to circulate. Some were rooted in truth, others grew taller with every retelling, but together they created the legend that would eventually eclipse the man himself. Rasputin was born in 1869 in Pokrovskoye, a farming settlement resting along the cold Tura River. Life there followed the rhythm of the seasons rather than the calendar. Summers were spent working the fields from sunrise until sunset. Winters were so bitter that simply fetching water felt like negotiating with nature itself. There was little opportunity for education, and Rasputin never became a polished scholar. He could read only with difficulty, signed documents awkwardly, and spoke with the rough accent of the Siberian countryside. Yet people noticed something about him. Contemporaries frequently described his eyes before mentioning anything else. They spoke of an intense, unwavering stare that made conversation strangely uncomfortable. Whether this was genuine magnetism or simply the effect of someone refusing to break eye contact remains impossible to know. Either way, it left an impression. In his early 20s, Rasputin married Praskovia Dubrovina, a local peasant woman. Contrary to later myths, theirs appears to have been a genuine marriage. They had several children together, worked the family farm, and Praskovia remained his wife until his death. She tolerated his increasingly long absences with remarkable patience, perhaps because Siberian wives learned early that arguing with determined husbands was often less productive than waiting for them to tire themselves out. Nothing about these early years suggested Russia was about to gain its most infamous holy man. Then, somewhere around the age of 28, Rasputin experienced what he described as a profound religious awakening. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some historians suggest a personal crisis. Others point to visits to monasteries or encounters with wandering pilgrims. Whatever happened, he abandoned the predictable routine of village life and began travelling across Russia as a religious wanderer, known as a strannik. These pilgrims occupied an unusual place in Russian society. They owned little, slept wherever they could, and wandered from monastery to monastery seeking spiritual enlightenment. Many were deeply respected, others were harmless eccentrics. A few were outright frauds. Distinguishing among the three was not always easy. Rasputin quickly proved different from the average pilgrim. Unlike many preachers who relied on memorized scripture, he spoke conversationally, using simple language that ordinary people understood. He listened carefully before offering advice. Villagers claimed he remembered names, family troubles, and private worries months after hearing them. Whether this reflected extraordinary memory or careful observation, it created the impression that he possessed unusual insight. Women, in particular, often sought him out for spiritual counsel. In deeply religious rural communities, confessing personal struggles to a wandering holy man was not unusual. Yet Rasputin's style was remarkably personal. He encouraged long conversations, emotional openness, and physical gestures such as holding hands or embracing those in distress. To some, these were acts of compassion. To others, they seemed suspiciously intimate. At this stage, there is remarkably little reliable evidence that Rasputin was engaged in widespread sexual relationships. Most sensational stories about his younger years were written decades later by critics eager to portray him as morally corrupt from the beginning. Modern historians generally agree that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. Still, the rumours had begun. In villages across Siberia, people whispered that certain women seemed unusually devoted to the wandering holy man. Some insisted his prayers healed emotional suffering. Others claimed his attention lingered longer than it should. No accusations could be firmly proven, yet the gossip spread with remarkable speed. It was the first glimpse of a pattern that would follow Rasputin for the rest of his life. Wherever he went, admiration and suspicion arrived together. Some saw a gifted spiritual guide, others saw a dangerous manipulator hiding behind religion. Soon, those whispers would leave the quiet villages of Siberia behind and reach the glittering salons of St. Petersburg, where gossip travelled even faster, and the consequences would become far more explosive. By the time Rasputin reached St. Petersburg in the early 1900s, he had already spent years wandering across Russia as a self-proclaimed holy man. He arrived with no wealth, no official church position, and certainly no invitation to join the highest circles of the empire. Yet within only a few years, this bearded Siberian peasant would be dining with princes, advising duchesses, and earning the trust of the most powerful woman in Russia. It was a social climb so unlikely that even the palace staff struggled to believe they were witnessing it. St. Petersburg was unlike anything Rasputin had ever known. The imperial capital glittered with grand avenues, marble palaces, and fashionable salons where the aristocracy debated politics, philosophy, and spirituality over lavish dinners. Among the wealthy, there was a growing fascination with mysticism. Fortune-tellers, spiritual healers, miracle workers, and wandering monks all found eager audiences. For many nobles, traditional religion no longer felt satisfying. They wanted something more personal, more emotional, perhaps even miraculous. Rasputin arrived at exactly the right moment. Unlike polished priests who delivered formal sermons, he spoke in simple language filled with vivid imagery. He quoted scripture imperfectly but passionately, often describing faith as something to be experienced rather than merely studied. His rough manners, which would have seemed embarrassing in most settings, actually reinforced his reputation for authenticity. Here was a man who looked untouched by court politics, at least That was the impression. The first people to champion him were not powerful politicians, but aristocratic women searching for spiritual guidance. Many invited him into their homes for private gatherings where he would pray, answer questions, and speak for hours about humility, repentance, and God's mercy. These meetings often stretched late into the evening. Guests described leaving in tears, convinced they had encountered someone with extraordinary spiritual insight. Women seemed particularly drawn to him, though the reasons varied widely. Some admired his apparent sincerity. Others found comfort in his willingness to discuss personal struggles without judgment. Unlike many clergymen, Rasputin listened more than he preached. He asked about fears, marriages, illnesses, and family troubles. He maintained intense eye contact that many later described as almost hypnotic. Whether this reflected remarkable charisma or simply an unusual personality remains impossible to measure, but nearly everyone who met him commented on it. Eventually his reputation reached influential church figures and members of the aristocracy who introduced him to the imperial family. Tsarina Alexandra desperately searched for anyone capable of helping her son, Alexei, whose haemophilia left him vulnerable to life-threatening bleeding. Doctors repeatedly failed to provide lasting comfort. Rasputin, however, appeared able to calm the frightened boy during several crises. Exactly how he accomplished this remains debated. Some historians believe his soothing presence reduced Alexei's stress, indirectly easing symptoms. Others suggest he discouraged treatments that unintentionally worsened the condition. Whatever the explanation, Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin had been sent by God to protect her son. With that belief, his position at court became remarkably secure. Yet as Rasputin's influence grew, so did the whispers surrounding his relationships with women. Servants noticed noble ladies visiting him privately. Society gossip columns hinted that spiritual counselling sometimes became unusually intimate. Political enemies eagerly repeated every rumour they heard, while devoted followers dismissed them as malicious lies. At first, no one could prove anything, but in the glittering world of the imperial court, appearances often mattered more than evidence. The holy man who claimed to save souls was about to discover that every private conversation could become tomorrow's scandal, and every devoted admirer could become another chapter in the legend that would consume his name. Once Rasputin became a familiar face in St. Petersburg's highest circles, the rumours surrounding his private life multiplied faster than anyone could keep track of them. Some claimed he was a saint, blessed with extraordinary spiritual gifts. Others insisted he was a fraud, who had discovered that religion opened more doors than any noble title ever could. Somewhere between those two extremes stood the real Rasputin, though finding him has challenged historians for more than a century. One fact is beyond dispute. Women continued to gather around him in remarkable numbers. Some visited his apartment seeking advice about troubled marriages. Others hoped he could heal illnesses, restore their faith, or simply offer comfort during difficult times. Many were wealthy aristocrats accustomed to formal etiquette, yet Rasputin encouraged an entirely different atmosphere. Instead of stiff conversations, he preferred emotional confessions. Instead of distant sermons, he embraced people, held their hands, looked directly into their eyes, and prayed with surprising intensity. To devoted followers, this made him refreshingly genuine. To critics, it looked deeply inappropriate. Witnesses described women kissing his hands, asking for blessings, and sometimes weeping openly during his prayers. Several later admitted they felt an almost irresistible attraction toward him, though they struggled to explain why. By conventional standards, Rasputin was hardly considered handsome. He was tall and unkempt, with tangled hair, a thick beard, rough peasant clothing, and manners that often ignored every rule of aristocratic society. Yet charisma has rarely followed conventional standards of beauty. His greatest strength may have been making people feel completely understood. Adding fuel to the controversy were persistent stories linking Rasputin to an obscure religious sect known as the Kleisti. This mystical movement rejected the formal rituals of the Orthodox Church and believed that intense spiritual experiences brought believers closer to God. Their enemies accused them of practicing secret ceremonies involving ecstatic dancing, self-punishment, and even sexual rituals designed to overcome sin through indulgence before repentance. The accusations were explosive. If true, they would explain why some claimed Rasputin preached that resisting temptation was less important than experiencing it, and then sincerely repenting afterward. According to these stories, one could not truly conquer sin without first surrendering to it. It was a shocking idea. The problem is that historians have never found convincing evidence proving Rasputin actually belonged to the Kleisti. Modern scholars generally believe the connection was exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated, by opponents eager to discredit him. Police investigations monitored him for years, but failed to produce definitive proof of membership in the sect. That did little to slow the gossip. Former followers began telling increasingly dramatic stories about private meetings that supposedly blurred the line between spiritual guidance and physical intimacy. Newspapers eagerly repeated anonymous allegations. Political rivals circulated lurid tales in salons and government offices. Every whispered accusation seemed more unbelievable than the last, yet each one spread further than the previous rumour. Ironically, Rasputin himself often made matters worse. He rarely bothered denying the stories with any urgency. Sometimes he laughed them off. Sometimes he shrugged. Occasionally he hinted that people misunderstood his methods without ever clearly explaining them. For a man already viewed with suspicion, silence proved almost as damaging as confession. As Russia's elite became increasingly divided over the mysterious holy man, one question refused to disappear. Were these merely malicious slanders aimed at destroying an influential advisor, or had Rasputin's spiritual ministry become something far more intimate behind closed doors? Before long, those whispers would evolve into scandals involving specific women, named witnesses, and allegations that threatened not only his own reputation, but the credibility of the imperial family itself. By the time Rasputin reached the height of his influence, gossip about his relationships with women had evolved from quiet whispers into full-blown public obsession. Newspapers hinted at secret affairs without always naming names. Political cartoons portrayed him surrounded by elegantly dressed ladies. Even foreign journalists began describing him as a monk who collected admirers as enthusiastically as other men collected expensive wines. Reality, however, proved considerably more complicated than the cartoons. There is little doubt that Rasputin enjoyed female company. Numerous witnesses recalled his habit of receiving women alone in his apartment, often for hours at a time. Some arrived seeking prayers, others spiritual advice, and a few simply wanted to meet the mysterious man everyone in the capital was discussing. His home became a curious mixture of chapel, counselling office and social gathering, where noble women might find themselves sitting beside peasants, merchants, or government officials. This unusual openness shocked polite society. Respectable Orthodox priests generally maintained clear boundaries between themselves and female parishioners. Rasputin ignored many of those expectations. He embraced visitors, kissed them on the forehead, held their hands during prayers, and encouraged emotional honesty that often bordered on confession. For some women, These encounters were deeply moving. For others, they became intensely personal. Several women later claimed they had intimate relationships with Rasputin. Their testimonies varied dramatically. Some described genuine affection, others portrayed themselves as spiritually manipulated. A few admitted they willingly pursued him because they believed physical closeness to a holy man carried religious significance. Sorting truth from exaggeration is extraordinarily difficult because many of these accounts appeared years later, often after Rasputin's death, when sensational stories sold newspapers and memoirs remarkably well. Perhaps the most reliable evidence comes from Rasputin's own behavior. He rarely claimed to be sexually pure. Unlike many religious figures, he never presented himself as an ascetic who had renounced earthly temptation. In fact, acquaintances recalled him admitting that he remained an ordinary sinner struggling against human desires. This honesty, strange as it sounds, actually strengthened the loyalty of some followers. They believed a man who acknowledged his flaws was more trustworthy than one pretending to possess perfect virtue. His critics interpreted the same behaviour very differently. To them, Rasputin used religion as a convenient excuse for seduction. Every private meeting became evidence of corruption. Every smiling admirer became proof of another affair. As stories spread through St. Petersburg, it became increasingly difficult for anyone to separate genuine testimony from political propaganda. The women themselves were equally diverse. They included wealthy countesses, deeply religious widows, actresses, servants, merchants' wives, and curious socialites. Many visited only once. Others remained devoted followers for years. Not all relationships were romantic, and not every admirer became a lover, despite what later legends suggested. Yet even innocent friendships appeared suspicious once Rasputin's reputation had been thoroughly transformed into public scandal. Meanwhile, government agents quietly watched from the shadows. Police reports documented visitors entering and leaving his apartment, hoping to uncover evidence that could finally expose the mysterious Siberian once and for all. What they discovered would only deepen the controversy, because the more investigators observed Rasputin's private life, the less it resembled either the perfect saint his followers imagined, or the insatiable monster his enemies desperately wanted the public to believe. By 1912, Rasputin's private life had ceased to be merely a matter of gossip. It had become a political weapon. Every new rumour about his relationships with women was no longer simply an attack on Rasputin himself. It was an attack on the Romanov dynasty. If the mysterious Siberian holy man truly enjoyed unlimited access to aristocratic women and the imperial palace, then, critics argued, what did that say about the people who welcomed him? For Russia's political elite, this question became impossible to ignore. Members of the Duma, military officers, Orthodox bishops, and influential nobles had already grown suspicious of Rasputin's influence over Tsarina Alexandra. His supposed sexual exploits gave them something far more damaging than religious disagreements. They now possessed stories that could be repeated at dinner parties, printed in newspapers, whispered through government offices, and passed between foreign diplomats. Scandal spreads far faster than theology. Soon, exaggerated tales painted Rasputin as a man who seduced nearly every woman he encountered. According to the wildest stories, noble women abandoned their dignity whenever he entered a room. Wives secretly visited his apartment under the cover of darkness. Young women supposedly believed sleeping with him would cleanse their souls. Most of these claims cannot be verified. Historians generally agree that Rasputin almost certainly had sexual relationships outside his marriage. The evidence from police surveillance, eyewitness testimony, and contemporary accounts makes complete denial difficult. However, The enormous number of alleged affairs often quoted in popular books has little historical foundation. As his fame increased, almost every anonymous rumour found its way into print, where repetition gradually transformed speculation into accepted fact. The Russian press played a significant role in that transformation. Although strict censorship often protected the imperial family, newspapers discovered clever ways to attack Rasputin without directly accusing the Tsar or Tsarina. Satirical magazines published cartoons showing a wild-eyed monk surrounded by fashionable ladies. Writers hinted at immoral behaviour through carefully chosen language, allowing readers to imagine details far more outrageous than anything explicitly printed. Foreign newspapers were even less restrained. French, British and German journalists portrayed Rasputin as the embodiment of Russia's supposed backwardness. Stories described drunken parties, endless affairs, secret orgies, and hypnotized aristocrats. Many articles relied on second-hand sources or outright hearsay, yet readers across Europe eagerly consumed every scandalous headline. Meanwhile, Russia's secret police kept watching. Their surveillance reports reveal a more ordinary picture than the newspapers suggested. Officers noted women entering Rasputin's apartment, conversations lasting several hours, occasional drinking, prayers, and private meetings. Some reports strongly implied sexual encounters. Others described nothing more remarkable than visitors seeking advice or blessings. Even the investigators could not always determine where spiritual counselling ended and romantic involvement began. Perhaps the greatest irony was that Rasputin seemed almost indifferent to the damage these stories caused. He rarely attempted to repair his public image. Friends urged him to behave more discreetly, avoid private meetings with women, and distance himself from controversy. He usually ignored the advice. He appeared convinced that God alone would judge him. Unfortunately for Rasputin, politics rarely waits for divine judgment. His enemies had already concluded that removing him was essential for saving the monarchy. The stories about his sex life, whether true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, had become so deeply woven into Russia's political crisis that separating the man from the myth was no longer possible. Before long, those myths would inspire a conspiracy that ended not in another newspaper headline, but in murder. By the winter of 1916, many of Russia's most powerful men had reached the same conclusion. They no longer believed Rasputin could simply be ignored. In their eyes, he had become a national embarrassment. Whether they viewed him as a genuine fraud, a dangerous political advisor, or an immoral holy man mattered little. His influence over Tsarina Alexandra, combined with the endless rumours about his private life, convinced them that removing him was now a patriotic duty. Russia was already collapsing under the pressure of the First World War. Millions of soldiers had died. Food shortages plagued the cities. Confidence in the monarchy was evaporating. And somehow, one Siberian peasant seemed to be standing at the centre of the storm. Among those determined to act was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Russia. Young, educated, and immensely privileged, Yusupov despised everything Rasputin represented. He believed the holy man had corrupted both the imperial family and the nation's reputation. Years later, however, Yusupov would add another motivation. In his memoirs, he suggested that Rasputin had behaved inappropriately toward him, describing uncomfortable encounters and implying that the holy man showed an unusual personal interest. Historians remain deeply divided over these claims. Some believe Yusupov exaggerated the story to make the murder appear more justified or dramatic. Others think there may have been genuine incidents that were later embellished. Like so much surrounding Rasputin, certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. What is certain is that Yusupov understood the public image of Rasputin perfectly. He knew that accusations involving sex captured attention far more effectively than arguments about politics. By 1916, Rasputin's reputation as a womanizer had become so firmly established that almost any new allegation sounded believable. The conspiracy quickly expanded. Yusupov recruited Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, politician Vladimir Purishkevich, and several trusted associates. Together they developed a plan that sounded almost theatrical. Rasputin would be invited to Yusupov's palace late at night under the pretense of meeting the prince's beautiful wife, Irina. There was one small complication. Irina was not even in the city. The invitation itself relied on Rasputin's well-known appreciation for attractive women. Whether he believed he was about to enjoy a private meeting or merely accepted another social invitation remains unknown. Either way, shortly after midnight, he entered the Moika Palace without realizing he was walking into history. What happened next became one of the most famous murder stories ever told. According to Yusupov's later account, Rasputin calmly ate cakes laced with cyanide and drank poisoned wine without showing any sign of illness. When the poison supposedly failed, Yusupov claimed he shot him in the chest. Rasputin then miraculously stood back up, staggered through the courtyard, and attempted to escape before being shot again and finally thrown into the freezing Neva River. It is an unforgettable story. It is also almost certainly fiction. When most people hear the words Silk Road, they imagine a single dusty trail stretching from China to Europe, lined with endless camel caravans carrying silk, spices, and perhaps one particularly grumpy merchant wondering whose brilliant idea it was to cross another desert. It is a wonderful image. It is also almost entirely wrong. The Silk Road was never one road. It was an enormous network of trade routes that twisted across mountains, deserts, grasslands and fertile river valleys, connecting thousands of towns over nearly 4,000 miles. Some paths lasted centuries before disappearing beneath shifting sands. Others flourished only briefly as kingdoms rose and fell. Together, they formed something closer to the ancient world's internet than a simple highway. Goods, ideas, religions, diseases, inventions, and stories all travelled these routes, sometimes reaching places their creators could scarcely imagine. Surprisingly, very few merchants ever completed the entire journey. A Roman trader rarely walked all the way to China, just as a Chinese merchant seldom reached the Mediterranean. Instead, products changed hands countless times. A bolt of Chinese silk might pass through the hands of dozens of traders before finally reaching a wealthy Roman senator. By then, nobody involved had the slightest idea who had originally woven it. The route itself was as dangerous as it was profitable. Travellers faced towering mountain passes where snow lingered well into summer. They crossed deserts so vast that a wrong turn could become a death sentence. Sandstorms erased footprints within minutes, wells dried without warning, and bandits patiently waited for caravans carrying fortunes in cloth, jade, spices, or precious metals. Even experienced guides could disappear beneath the unforgiving landscape. Ancient travellers often joked that the desert collected more merchants than customers. It was dark humour, but history suggests they were not entirely exaggerating. Yet despite these dangers, people kept coming. Why? Because the rewards were extraordinary. A successful merchant could return home with enough wealth to transform his family's future. A ruler who controlled a strategic oasis could grow rich simply by taxing passing caravans. Entire cities emerged in places where, by all logic, no city should have existed at all. Those cities became the true heartbeat of the Silk Road. Many were dazzling centres of culture, where Persian astronomers debated with Indian monks, Greek sculptors borrowed ideas from Buddhist artists, and Chinese diplomats negotiated with nomadic chiefs over steaming bowls of unfamiliar food. Dozens of languages echoed through crowded marketplaces. Religious temples stood only a few streets apart. Travellers from opposite ends of Eurasia could meet without sharing a single common word, yet still managed to bargain over a sack of pepper. Today, names like Samarkand may still ring a bell, but countless other kingdoms have nearly vanished from memory. Their palaces lie buried beneath drifting dunes. Their walls crumble quietly in forgotten valleys. Some are known only because a traveller scribbled their name into a journal nearly 2,000 years ago. Over the course of this journey, you will visit those hidden kingdoms, not merely as places on a map, but as living worlds filled with ambitious rulers, ingenious merchants, remarkable cultures, and ordinary people whose lives helped connect half the known world, even if history almost forgot they were ever there. As the Silk Road stretched eastward beyond Persia's fertile plains, travellers eventually reached a region unlike any other. Here, surrounded by deserts and mountains, stood a civilization that rarely built vast empires or commanded enormous armies. Instead, it mastered something far more valuable: trade. This was Sogdia, a kingdom centered around the magnificent cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan. While Rome conquered with legions and China expanded through imperial dynasties, the Sogdians quietly built one of history's greatest commercial networks. If the Silk Road had a beating heart, it was here. The geography alone made the region extraordinary. To the south rose the towering Pamir Mountains, sometimes called the roof of the world. To the west stretched Persia. To the east lay China. Northward extended the endless Central Asian steppes, home to powerful nomadic tribes. Nearly every caravan travelling between east and west eventually passed through Sogdian territory, making its cities some of the busiest crossroads on earth. Imagine arriving after weeks crossing dusty plains. You enter Samarkand through massive gates, immediately surrounded by sounds from every corner of Eurasia. Merchants shout prices in Persian, Turkish, Chinese, Sanskrit, and languages that have long since disappeared. Camels groan beneath mountains of silk. Horses from the steppes stand beside Indian elephants. The scent of cinnamon mixes with roasting lamb, incense, and leather. Somewhere nearby, a musician plays a melody that sounds unfamiliar to everyone, and somehow familiar to everyone at the same time. This was everyday life. Unlike many kingdoms, the Sogdians became famous less for what they produced than for how brilliantly they connected others. They acted as middlemen between civilizations, buying goods in one region and selling them thousands of miles away. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian silver, Roman glass, Byzantine textiles, and precious gemstones all passed through their warehouses. They also traded something impossible to pack into a camel's saddle: ideas. Sogdian merchants carried religions across Asia just as efficiently as silk. Buddhism travelled toward China. Christianity reached Central Asia. Zoroastrianism remained strong at home, while later Islam transformed the region after the Arab conquests. Walk through a Sogdian city, and you might pass a Buddhist monastery, a Zoroastrian fire temple, and a Christian church before lunchtime. Ancient cities rarely celebrated diversity as a modern ideal, but commerce had a way of encouraging tolerance. After all, arguing over theology was rarely as profitable as agreeing on the price of silk. The merchants themselves became legendary. Unlike rulers who stayed within palace walls, Sogdian traders spent years travelling enormous distances. Some settled permanently in Chinese cities, married local families, and learned entirely new languages. Others crossed deserts so often they could navigate by stars invisible to most people. They became cultural interpreters as much as businessmen, explaining foreign customs to puzzled clients separated by thousands of miles and countless traditions. Yet despite their extraordinary success, the Sogdians slowly disappeared. Arab conquests in the 8th century transformed the political and religious landscape. New powers took control of the trade routes, while later invasions, most famously those led by Genghis Khan, devastated many of Central Asia's greatest cities. Their language gradually faded, their independent identity dissolved, and one of history's greatest merchant civilizations quietly blended into the cultures around it. Ironically, the people who connected the ancient world became one of its most forgotten kingdoms. Their cities survived, but the remarkable civilization that made them famous slowly vanished, leaving behind only fragments for historians and curious travellers to piece together. Leaving the bustling markets of Sogdia, the Silk Road climbed toward a kingdom that seemed almost impossible. Here, surrounded by rugged mountains and wind-swept valleys, stood cities where Greek philosophers walked beneath Buddhist temples, where soldiers descended from Alexander the Great married local women, and where cultures separated by thousands of miles somehow became neighbours. Welcome to Bactria. Located across parts of modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and northern Uzbekistan, Bactria was known to ancient writers as the land of 1,000 cities. Whether there were actually 1,000 is another matter. Ancient historians occasionally treated numbers the way fishermen treat the size of their biggest catch. Still, there is little doubt that Bactria was one of the richest regions along the Silk Road. Its wealth came from geography. Snow melt from the Hindu Kush mountains fed fertile valleys where wheat, grapes, and fruit orchards flourished. Rivers carried water across land that otherwise would have surrendered to the surrounding deserts. Caravans travelling between Persia, India, Central Asia, and China naturally converged here, turning Bactrian cities into prosperous trading hubs. Then, in the 4th century before Christ, everything changed. Alexander the Great marched into Bactria during his campaign against the Persian Empire. Conquering the region proved far more difficult than defeating Persia itself. Local tribes fought fiercely, disappearing into mountains before striking again. What Alexander expected to be a quick victory became one of his longest and most frustrating campaigns. Eventually, he prevailed. But instead of simply occupying the region, he encouraged thousands of Greek settlers to remain. Veterans built new towns, introduced Greek architecture, theatres, gymnasiums, and marketplaces, while local traditions continued to thrive alongside them. It was less a replacement of cultures than an unexpected partnership. For nearly 2 centuries after Alexander's death, his successors ruled the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Imagine strolling through one of its cities. A marble statue of Hercules stands beside a marketplace selling Indian spices. A philosopher debates Aristotle beneath a colonnade, while nearby craftsmen carve Buddhist symbols into stone. Coins bear Greek inscriptions on one side and local imagery on the other. Children grow up speaking multiple languages without thinking twice about it. Few places in the ancient world blended civilization so completely. Perhaps the greatest example of this cultural fusion appeared in art. Greek sculptors introduced realistic human forms and flowing robes, techniques that local artists soon adopted when depicting the Buddha. Before this period, Buddhist traditions rarely portrayed him in human form. In Bactria and neighbouring Gandhara, however, the Buddha suddenly acquired distinctly Greek features, wavy hair, calm expressions, elegant drapery, and idealized proportions worthy of a classical statue. It remains one of history's most extraordinary artistic collaborations, yet Bactria's prosperity could not last forever. Nomadic tribes pressed southward. Internal conflicts weakened the kingdom. New empires rose on every frontier. Gradually, the Greek rulers disappeared, absorbed into the ever-changing political landscape of Central Asia. By the 1st century before Christ, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom had vanished. Its cities slowly crumbled beneath centuries of dust, earthquakes, and conquest. Yet beneath those ruins, archaeologists continue to uncover reminders of an astonishing civilization where East and West did far more than trade goods. They learned how to become something entirely new together. As the Greek kingdoms of Bactria slowly disappeared into history, another civilization rose from the same crossroads. It did not simply inherit the Silk Road, it mastered it. The Kushan Empire is one of history's greatest forgotten superpowers. Ask someone to name the ancient world's great empires, and they will probably mention Rome, Han China, perhaps Persia. Very few will think of the Kushans, despite the fact that for nearly 2 centuries they controlled one of the most valuable stretches of the Silk Road, connecting civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Their story began with migration. The Kushans originally belonged to a nomadic confederation known as the Yuezhi, a people forced westward after being driven from their homeland by rival tribes in what is now northwestern China. Like many displaced peoples throughout history, they faced a choice: disappear or adapt. They chose something far more ambitious. After settling in Bactria, the Kushans gradually united several competing clans and built an empire stretching across modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India, and parts of Central Asia. They occupied perhaps the most strategic position imaginable. Every major caravan moving between east and west eventually passed through their territory. Unlike conquerors obsessed with expansion alone, the Kushans understood that prosperity often flowed from stability. Merchants cared less about who ruled than whether the roads remained safe, so the Kushans invested heavily in protecting trade routes. Garrisons guarded mountain passes. Caravan cities flourished behind sturdy walls. Markets expanded, attracting traders from Persia, India, China, and even distant Rome. A merchant arriving in a Kushan city might hear half a dozen languages before finishing breakfast, assuming breakfast had survived the previous week's camel ride. The empire reached its height under Emperor Kanishka. Although historians still debate the exact dates of his reign, they agree that he transformed the Kushans into one of Asia's dominant powers. Kanishka encouraged trade, supported artists and scholars, and became one of Buddhism's greatest royal patrons. This changed far more than his own empire. Buddhist monks had travelled before, but under Kushan protection, they could move safely along the Silk Road, carrying sacred texts, sculptures, and new ideas into Central Asia and eventually China. Without the Kushans, Buddhism might never have spread across East Asia with the same speed or influence. Religion itself reflected the empire's extraordinary diversity. Kushan coins are almost like tiny museums. One might depict a Greek god, another a Persian deity, another the Buddha, and yet another an Indian god. Rather than replacing one belief system with another, the Kushans seemed remarkably comfortable borrowing from all of them. Their empire was less a melting pot than an enormous marketplace of cultures, where different traditions stood side by side without feeling the need to erase one another. The cities reflected that same spirit. Temples, monasteries, workshops, and caravanserais lined busy streets filled with merchants negotiating over silk, ivory, gemstones, spices, fine horses and glassware. Travellers from opposite ends of Eurasia often met here for the first time, exchanging not only goods, but recipes, technologies, fashions, and stories that would continue travelling long after their owners had moved on. Yet even great crossroads can become forgotten. As new powers emerged, trade routes shifted and political pressures mounted. The Kushan Empire gradually fragmented, absorbed by neighbouring kingdoms and invading forces. Its cities survived, but its name slowly faded from popular memory. Even so, every caravan that safely crossed Asia owed something to this overlooked empire, whose greatest achievement was proving that commerce could unite worlds that conquest never truly could. Leaving the fertile valleys of the Kushan Empire, the Silk Road entered one of its most unforgiving stretches. Ahead lay the Taklamakan Desert, a sea of shifting sand so vast and so deadly that ancient travellers coined a chilling warning about it. "You may enter," they said, "but you will never come out." Whether anyone actually spoke those exact words is impossible to know, but after seeing the landscape, you would probably avoid testing the theory. The Taklamakan is one of the largest deserts on Earth. Towering dunes stretch toward the horizon, while summer temperatures can climb above 50 degrees Celsius. Water is scarce, vegetation almost non-existent, and sandstorms can erase entire caravan tracks within minutes. For merchants carrying fortunes in silk and spices, crossing it without careful planning was less an adventure than a carefully organised gamble with death. Fortunately, nature had left behind a series of miracles. Along the southern edge of the desert, rivers flowing from the Kunlun Mountains created scattered green oases. Around these precious pockets of water, towns flourished. Among them, none became more important than the kingdom of Khotan. Without Khotan, many caravans simply would not have survived. The kingdom occupied a strategic position where exhausted merchants could rest, repair equipment, replace sick animals, and refill their water supplies before continuing east or west. Every arriving caravan brought not only goods, but also news from distant lands. A traveller leaving Rome might hear the latest events from India long before reaching China. In Khotan, the world seemed strangely small. Unlike many Silk Road kingdoms, Khotan possessed valuable resources of its own. Its rivers carried beautiful jade, a stone treasured in China for thousands of years. Long before silk became the region's most famous commodity, Chinese emperors eagerly sought Khotan's jade for ceremonial objects, jewellery, and imperial rituals. Some pieces travelled hundreds of miles before reaching the imperial court, where they were considered priceless. Then came one of history's greatest industrial secrets. For centuries, China maintained an absolute monopoly on silk production. The methods of raising silkworms and weaving silk were guarded with extraordinary care. Exporting silkworm eggs was punishable by death. Foreign merchants could purchase finished silk, but were never allowed to learn how it was made. At least, that was the plan. According to one enduring legend, a Chinese princess was arranged to marry the king of Khotan. Knowing she would never again see her homeland, she refused to leave behind one luxury she cherished above all else: silk. Hidden inside her elaborate hairstyle, or in some versions, beneath an ornate headdress, she secretly carried silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds across the border. If the story is true, it changed economic history. Khotan soon developed its own silk industry, becoming one of the first places outside China capable of producing the precious fabric. Historians still debate how much of the tale is fact and how much is romantic embellishment, but archaeological evidence confirms that silk production eventually flourished there. Khotan also became one of Buddhism's greatest strongholds along the Silk Road. Magnificent monasteries welcomed weary travellers, offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. Monks copied sacred texts that would continue their journey into China, Korea, and eventually Japan. For centuries, this small oasis kingdom stood as proof that even in the harshest desert, civilization could flourish. Yet, like so many hidden kingdoms along the Silk Road, Khotan would eventually be swallowed not by sand alone, but by the relentless march of history, leaving behind only ruins where bustling markets once echoed with voices from every corner of the ancient world. Beyond the kingdom of Khotan, the Silk Road slowly curved toward one of its most extraordinary destinations. Every merchant, monk, diplomat, and explorer eventually hoped to reach it, because beyond this city lay the gates of China itself. This was Dunhuang. To weary travellers, its appearance must have felt almost miraculous. After weeks of crossing barren deserts and endless gravel plains, green fields suddenly emerged beside the Dang River. Poplar trees swayed in the breeze. Irrigation canals carried fresh mountain water into farms and orchards. For exhausted caravans, it was less a city than a promise that civilization still existed. Dunhuang stood at one of the most important crossroads in Asia. Here, the Silk Road split into northern and southern routes around the deadly Taklamakan Desert, before joining again farther west. Whether you were travelling toward Persia, India, or the Chinese capital, chances were you would pass through Dunhuang sooner or later. That constant flow of travellers transformed the city into something remarkable. Walk through its bustling streets, and you might encounter Chinese officials inspecting trade permits, Persian merchants unloading carpets, Indian monks carrying sacred manuscripts, Turkish horse traders negotiating prices, and musicians from Central Asia performing melodies unlike anything heard elsewhere in China. No one found this unusual. For Dunhuang, diversity was simply another ordinary day. Yet the city's greatest treasures were not found in its marketplaces. Just outside the city rose a series of sandstone cliffs overlooking the desert. Beginning in the 4th century, Buddhist monks started carving small meditation caves into the rock. Generation after generation expanded them, adding larger chambers, elaborate statues, and breathtaking wall paintings. Over the centuries, these became the famous Mogao caves. Inside, artists covered entire walls with colourful scenes depicting the life of the Buddha, heavenly musicians, kings, merchants, and ordinary pilgrims making their long journeys across Asia. The paintings blended artistic traditions from India, Persia, Central Asia, and China so seamlessly that historians can trace the movement of cultures simply by studying the brushstrokes. The caves also became an unexpected library. Monks carefully copied religious texts by hand, preserving Buddhist scriptures alongside historical records, contracts, calendars, medical manuals, dictionaries, musical notation, and even personal letters. Few people realized they were quietly creating one of the greatest archives of the medieval world. Then, around the 11th century, something curious happened. One of the caves was sealed shut. No one knows exactly why. Some scholars believe valuable manuscripts were hidden to protect them from invading armies. Others think the cave simply became too full and was respectfully closed. Whatever the reason, thousands of documents remained untouched for nearly 900 years. When the hidden library was rediscovered in the early 20th century, historians could scarcely believe what they were seeing. More than 50,000 manuscripts had survived almost perfectly preserved by the desert's dry climate. Suddenly, forgotten languages, lost kingdoms, ancient business contracts, and everyday conversations from the Silk Road reappeared after centuries of silence. It was as though the ancient world had left behind its own time capsule, Dunhuang reminds us that the Silk Road carried far more than silk. It transported ideas worth writing down, paintings worth preserving, and stories worth remembering. And without realizing it, one quiet desert city became the guardian of countless civilizations that might otherwise have disappeared forever beneath the shifting sands. Leaving Dunhuang behind, the Silk Road entered a landscape that seemed almost impossible. Endless deserts stretched in every direction, broken only by jagged mountains and the occasional ribbon of green clinging stubbornly to life. Hidden among these harsh surroundings stood another forgotten kingdom, one that welcomed nearly every civilization travelling across Asia. This was Gaochang. Located near today's Turpan in western China, Gaochang flourished because it possessed the one thing every Silk Road traveller desperately needed: water. The surrounding Turpan Basin is one of the hottest places in Asia. Summer temperatures regularly climb well above 40 degrees Celsius, while the ground itself can become hot enough to cook an egg if you are unusually patient and remarkably careless. Rain rarely falls, yet somehow vineyards, orchards and wheat fields covered parts of the oasis. Long before Socrates became the most famous philosopher in history, he was simply another citizen of Athens. There were no prophecies announcing his birth, no royal bloodline, and certainly no expectation that this rather ordinary-looking man would one day influence nearly every branch of Western philosophy. If you had walked past him in the marketplace as a young man, you probably would have remembered the olive seller before you remembered Socrates. He was born around 470 before Christ, during one of the most remarkable periods in Greek history. Athens was flourishing. Magnificent temples were rising above the city. Playwrights filled theatres with audiences. Artists perfected sculpture and democracy. Still a relatively new experiment was reshaping politics. It was an age of confidence. The Athenians believed their city was becoming the centre of the civilized world. Into this thriving society arrived a boy from a modest family. His father, Sophroniscus, worked as a stonemason or sculptor, shaping marble into useful objects, and perhaps helping construct some of the buildings that made Athens famous. His mother, Phaenarete, worked as a midwife, assisting women through childbirth. It was humble, respectable work, and Socrates would later joke that he had inherited something from both parents. His father shaped stone, while his mother helped bring people into the world. Socrates claimed he did something similar, except instead of delivering babies, he helped people give birth to ideas. Not everyone appreciated the comparison. As a child, Socrates likely received the standard education expected of an Athenian boy. He learned reading, writing, music, poetry, physical training, and the stories of Homer that every educated Greek knew by heart. Wealthier families hired famous teachers, but Socrates' upbringing appears to have been relatively ordinary. There is little evidence that anyone viewed him as a prodigy. In fact, later descriptions suggest he looked rather unusual. He was said to have a broad nose, bulging eyes, thick lips, and a stocky build. Compared with the idealized beauty celebrated in Greek sculpture, Socrates was almost the opposite. Some contemporaries even compared him to a satyr, one of the mischievous woodland creatures from Greek mythology, known for their flat noses and somewhat untidy appearance. It was not exactly the compliment most people hoped to receive. Fortunately for Socrates, he seemed completely unconcerned. Unlike many Athenians who cared deeply about appearance and reputation, he rarely dressed elegantly. He often walked barefoot, wore the same simple cloak year-round, and showed little interest in luxury. Friends later remarked that he could endure cold winters, long marches, and uncomfortable conditions with astonishing ease. While others complained about the weather, Socrates simply continued thinking. Before philosophy completely consumed his life, however, He fulfilled another important duty expected of every Athenian citizen. He became a soldier. Athens depended on ordinary citizens to defend the city, and Socrates served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman carrying a large shield, spear, and bronze armour. Campaigning was exhausting, dangerous work requiring discipline and courage. Fellow soldiers later recalled his remarkable endurance during long marches and his calmness in battle. Whatever opinions people eventually formed about his philosophy, few questioned his bravery. Yet it was not his military service that would make him unforgettable. Somewhere amid the crowded streets, noisy workshops, and bustling marketplaces of Athens, Socrates developed a habit that seemed harmless at first. He started asking questions. Simple questions. Ordinary questions. Questions that most people answered with complete confidence. Then, little by little, he would reveal that they did not actually know the answers at all. Athens had produced great generals, gifted artists, and brilliant politicians. It had never encountered anyone quite like Socrates, and before long, the city that celebrated wisdom would discover how uncomfortable genuine questioning could become. As Socrates grew older, something unusual became increasingly obvious. Unlike nearly every famous philosopher you can name today, he never wrote a single book. Not one. No carefully organized treatise. No collection of essays. Not even a modest scroll titled Thoughts I Had While Walking Around Athens. If Socrates ever kept personal notes, history has lost them completely. Everything we know about him survives because other people, most famously his student Plato, thought his conversations were too important to disappear. That decision would change the course of philosophy forever. In Athens, many intellectuals earned comfortable livings by teaching rhetoric. These professional educators, known as sophists, travelled from city to city offering lessons in public speaking, politics, and persuasion for a fee, of course. If you wanted to win arguments in court or impress voters during an assembly, they were happy to help. Socrates wanted nothing to do with that business. He refused to charge students. He insisted he possessed no special wisdom worth selling. In fact, he often claimed he knew almost nothing at all. At first glance, this sounded like remarkable humility. After spending a few minutes talking with him, however, people discovered it was also a remarkably effective trap. Imagine you're an ambitious young Athenian. You meet an older man wandering through the Agora, Athens' enormous marketplace. Around you, merchants bargain over olives, fishermen advertise the morning's catch, politicians campaign for support, blacksmiths hammer bronze, and philosophers gather eager listeners. The older man smiles politely. "So," he asks, "you seem confident. Tell me, what is courage?" Simple enough. You answer without hesitation. Courage means never being afraid. Socrates nods thoughtfully. Interesting. Then are reckless people courageous? You pause. Well, perhaps not. So courage requires wisdom? Yes. And can someone who acts wisely sometimes retreat instead of fighting? I suppose so. Then courage cannot simply mean never being afraid. Only a few questions have passed, yet suddenly the answer that seemed perfectly obvious no longer works. This became Socrates' signature approach. Rather than delivering speeches, he asked questions. One question led to another. Each answer created a new problem. By the end of the conversation, people often realized they understood far less than they had believed only minutes earlier. Today, this approach is known as the Socratic method, and more than 2,000 years later, it remains one of the most influential teaching techniques in the world. Law schools, philosophy departments, medical programs, and classrooms still use carefully structured questioning to encourage critical thinking instead of memorization. Socrates was not interested in giving people answers. He wanted them to discover their own. He compared himself to a gadfly, a tiny insect that persistently irritates a large horse. Athens, he argued, was the horse. Comfortable, successful, and perhaps a little too self-satisfied. His job was to keep stinging the city until it woke up and started thinking. As you might imagine, not everyone appreciated being compared to livestock. Some Athenians loved these conversations. Young men especially gathered around him, fascinated by the way respected politicians, wealthy businessmen, poets, and military officers often found themselves tangled in contradictions after only a few minutes of questioning. Watching Socrates dismantle an overconfident speaker became something of a public spectacle. Others found him deeply irritating. After all, nobody enjoys discovering that an opinion they have confidently held for decades falls apart under a handful of calm, perfectly reasonable questions. Socrates never shouted. He rarely insulted anyone. He simply kept asking. And in a city filled with ambitious men who built their reputations on appearing knowledgeable, that quiet habit proved surprisingly dangerous. Before long, the philosopher who claimed to know nothing would become famous for exposing just how little everyone else truly knew. By the time Socrates reached middle age, he had gained a peculiar reputation around Athens. Some people admired him, many avoided him, and a growing number quietly hoped they would never find themselves trapped in one of his conversations. Then something happened that transformed an eccentric philosopher into a legend. It began hundreds of miles away at Delphi. Nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus stood the Temple of Apollo, home to the most famous oracle in the Greek world. Kings, generals, merchants, and ordinary farmers all travelled there seeking divine guidance. The priestess, known as the Pythia, delivered Apollo's answers in mysterious phrases that priests then interpreted. One day, a loyal friend of Socrates named Chaerephon visited the oracle. He asked a surprisingly simple question. Is anyone wiser than Socrates? The reply became one of history's most famous declarations. No one is wiser. When Chaerephon returned to Athens and repeated the oracle's words, Socrates reacted in a way few people expected. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He did not begin introducing himself as officially certified by Apollo. Instead, he was deeply confused. How could he possibly be the wisest man in Greece? He believed he knew very little. Surely the oracle had made a mistake. Being Socrates, however, he decided there was only one sensible response. He would investigate. And so began one of the strangest philosophical quests in history. Socrates started visiting people widely considered wise. First came the politicians. These men confidently debated laws, diplomacy, and the future of Athens before enormous crowds. If anyone deserved the title of wisest citizen, surely it was them. The conversations rarely went well. Socrates politely asked them to explain concepts like justice, leadership, or virtue. At first, they answered confidently. But as the questions continued, contradictions slowly emerged. Definitions changed. Exceptions appeared. Certainty disappeared. Eventually, many politicians realized they could no longer defend the very ideas they claimed to understand. Socrates left with an uncomfortable conclusion. These men believed they were wise. They were not. Next came the poets. Surely those capable of composing magnificent verses possessed deep wisdom about life itself. Again, Socrates questioned them. To his surprise, many struggled to explain the meaning behind their own works. They had created beautiful poetry, but when asked why certain passages expressed truth or virtue, their answers often dissolved into vague guesses. Talent, Socrates concluded, was not the same as wisdom. Then he turned to craftsmen. Blacksmiths, sculptors, builders, physicians, and shipwrights certainly possessed genuine expertise. Unlike politicians, they truly understood their trades. Yet Socrates noticed something curious. Because they were masters in one field, many assumed they were equally knowledgeable about morality, politics, religion, and human nature. They knew everything about bronze, less so about justice. Piece by piece, the puzzle became clear. The oracle had not meant that Socrates possessed extraordinary knowledge. It meant something far stranger. He was wiser precisely because he recognized the limits of his own understanding. As Socrates famously concluded, "I know that I know nothing." Whether he spoke those exact words remains debated, but they perfectly capture his philosophy. Unfortunately, this revelation came with an unintended consequence. Every politician embarrassed in public became another enemy. Every poet left speechless carried away wounded pride. Every respected citizen who discovered the holes in his own arguments remembered exactly who had exposed them. The young men following Socrates found these exchanges endlessly entertaining. They laughed, admired his sharp reasoning, and began copying his style. The older generation was far less amused. Athens had once viewed Socrates as an unusual philosopher wandering the marketplace. Now many began seeing him as something considerably more dangerous, a man teaching an entire generation that authority should never be accepted without question. As Socrates' reputation as Athens' most persistent questioner continued to grow, it became easy to imagine him as a man who spent every waking hour wandering the marketplace, cornering unsuspecting politicians with philosophical puzzles. In reality, his life was far more ordinary. Before he became famous for questioning ideas, Socrates had proven himself on the battlefield. Athens expected every able-bodied male citizen to serve in the military, and Socrates fulfilled that duty several times during the Peloponnesian War, the long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta. This was no brief campaign or ceremonial parade. The war stretched over nearly 3 decades, exhausting the Greek world and slowly draining Athens of both wealth and confidence. Socrates fought as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman. Picture the equipment for a moment. A bronze helmet narrowed your vision. A heavy shield weighed nearly as much as a small child. Spears, armour, and weapons added even more weight. Then imagine marching mile after mile beneath the scorching Greek sun before facing an enemy determined to stab you with equal enthusiasm. Philosophy suddenly seems like the easier profession. Ancient accounts describe Socrates as an exceptionally disciplined soldier. Plato and Xenophon both record stories from fellow veterans who admired his endurance. During one winter campaign, he reportedly walked barefoot across frozen ground, while other soldiers wrapped themselves in every spare cloak they could find. Whether this happened exactly as described is impossible to verify, but multiple sources agree that Socrates tolerated hardship far better than most of his companions. His courage also became legendary. At the Battle of Potidæa, Socrates is said to have saved the life of the young aristocrat Alcibiades after fierce fighting. Later, during another campaign at Delium, witnesses recalled that Socrates retreated calmly and deliberately while panic spread through much of the Athenian army. Rather than fleeing blindly, he maintained his composure, making himself such a difficult target that pursuing enemies reportedly hesitated to attack. It was the same calmness he later displayed in philosophical debates. Pressure simply did not seem to affect him very much. When he returned home, however, he lived in striking contrast to many successful Athenians. While sophists charged generous fees for teaching, Socrates continued refusing payment. As a result, he remained surprisingly poor throughout his life. He owned little, dressed simply, and seemed almost indifferent to material comfort. Friends occasionally offered financial assistance, but he showed little interest in accumulating wealth. To Socrates, money solved practical problems. It did not improve the soul. His home life became almost as famous as his philosophy. Socrates married Xanthippe, and together they had several sons. Ancient writers often portrayed Xanthippe as sharp-tempered, impatient, and frequently frustrated by her husband's complete lack of financial ambition. One famous story claims that after enduring one of his lengthy conversations, she poured a bucket of water over his head. Socrates supposedly smiled and remarked, "After thunder comes rain." Whether the incident actually occurred is impossible to know. Many historians suspect later writers exaggerated Xanthippe's temper for comic effect, turning her into the stereotypical long-suffering wife of an absent-minded philosopher. In fairness, raising children while your husband spends his days discussing the nature of justice instead of earning a reliable income might test almost anyone's patience. Yet despite his poverty and unconventional lifestyle, Socrates never appeared unhappy. He believed happiness depended not on possessions, reputation, or political success, but on living a life guided by virtue and reason. Unfortunately, Athens was becoming a far less forgiving place. The Peloponnesian War had left the city bruised, divided, and suspicious. Citizens increasingly searched for people to blame for their misfortunes. And among the younger generation, one man seemed to possess an influence that many older Athenians were beginning to find deeply unsettling. By the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was no longer the proud, confident city where Socrates had grown up. The empire that had once dominated the Aegean had been defeated by Sparta. Thousands had died. The treasury was nearly empty. Political factions blamed one another for the disaster, while ordinary citizens wondered whether democracy itself had failed. In uncertain times, people often begin searching for simple explanations. Unfortunately for Socrates, he was becoming an increasingly convenient one. His daily conversations attracted dozens of young Athenians, many from the city's wealthiest and most influential families. Sons of generals, politicians, merchants, and aristocrats gathered around him in the agora, listening as he questioned respected public figures with relentless patience. To the young men, it was fascinating. To their parents, it was alarming. Imagine spending years building your reputation as an experienced statesman, only for your teenage son to come home asking whether you actually understood justice, courage, or virtue, because an elderly philosopher had politely dismantled your arguments in front of half the marketplace. Family dinners probably became spirited. Socrates never claimed to possess secret knowledge. Instead, he encouraged his students to question assumptions, challenge authority, and examine every belief before accepting it. Today, that sounds like the foundation of higher education. In ancient Athens, it sometimes looked suspiciously like encouraging rebellion. Adding to the concern was the company Socrates kept. Among his most brilliant students was Plato, who would later preserve his teacher's ideas for future generations. But not every admirer followed such a peaceful path. One of Socrates' closest associates was Alcibiades, perhaps the most talented and controversial politician Athens ever produced. Handsome, wealthy, ambitious, and spectacularly unpredictable, Alcibiades repeatedly switched political loyalties whenever it suited his ambitions. At various points, he served Athens, Sparta, and even Persia. Each betrayal made Socrates look slightly more guilty by association. Even more damaging was Critias. After Athens surrendered to Sparta, a brutal oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants briefly seized power. Critias became one of its leading figures, overseeing executions, confiscations of property, and widespread political persecution. His regime ruled through fear before democracy was eventually restored. Although Socrates openly criticized several actions of the 30 tyrants and even refused to obey one of their unjust orders, many Athenians remembered only one uncomfortable fact. Critias had once been his student. To ordinary citizens, the distinction mattered very little. If Socrates teaches young men, some wondered, why do so many troublesome ones seem to emerge from his circle? It was an unfair conclusion, but political fear rarely waits for careful reasoning. Meanwhile, Socrates continued behaving exactly as he always had. He questioned generals, he questioned politicians, he questioned poets, he questioned priests. Most dangerously of all, he questioned people who held power while making absolutely no effort to flatter them. Many philosophers seek influential friends. Socrates seemed remarkably talented at collecting influential enemies instead. The restored democracy wanted stability after decades of war, dictatorship, and civil conflict. Citizens were tired of controversy. They wanted unity, not another elderly philosopher encouraging ambitious young men to challenge accepted wisdom. Gradually, irritation hardened into suspicion. Suspicion became resentment. Resentment became something far more dangerous. Soon, 3 citizens would formally accuse Socrates of crimes against Athens itself. Their charges sounded simple enough, but behind them stood years of wounded pride, political anxiety, and personal humiliation. After a lifetime spent asking uncomfortable questions, Socrates would finally find himself forced to answer some of his own. In the year 399 before Christ, after decades of questioning nearly everyone in Athens, Socrates finally encountered a group of men who had grown tired of answering. They decided it was time for him to answer instead. 3 citizens brought formal charges against the 70-year-old philosopher. Their names were Meletus, a young poet, Anytus, a powerful politician and influential craftsman, and Lycon, an orator representing the interests of public speakers. Together they accused Socrates of 2 serious crimes. First, they claimed he did not believe in the traditional gods of Athens. Second, and perhaps more damaging, they accused him of corrupting the city's youth. At first glance, the charges seemed strange. Socrates often spoke about divine guidance. He openly discussed what he called his daimonion, an inner divine voice that warned him whenever he was about to make a mistake. Far from rejecting religion altogether, he believed deeply that the gods existed. The problem was that his beliefs did not always fit comfortably within traditional expectations. His habit of questioning accepted ideas made many Athenians wonder whether he encouraged others to question religion as well. The accusation of corrupting the youth was even more complicated. Socrates never established a formal school. He never required students to enroll. Young men simply chose to follow him because they enjoyed listening to his conversations. They copied his habit of questioning authority, challenging politicians, and exposing weak arguments. To older citizens, already exhausted by decades of political instability, this looked less like education and more like dangerous influence. Athens was still recovering from disaster. The Peloponnesian War had shattered the city's confidence. The brief but brutal rule of the 30 tyrants remained a painful memory. Democracy had only recently been restored, and many citizens feared that another generation of ambitious young men might once again throw the city into chaos. Socrates became an easy symbol of that anxiety. The trial took place before a jury unlike anything seen in modern courts. There was no single judge wearing elaborate robes. Instead, approximately 500 Athenian citizens served as jurors. After hearing both sides, they alone would determine guilt and punishment. When it came time for Socrates to defend himself, many expected an emotional speech. Perhaps he would beg for mercy. Perhaps he would apologize. Perhaps he would promise to stop teaching. He did none of those things.